that be necessary. Thank you for understanding. So, I hope everybody has their equipment working, and we are starting our next session. That session will deal with the security in Northeast Asia, threats, challenges, vulnerabilities, and risks. In preparation of the agenda, we decided to divide the challenges and threats in the region and the question of what can be done. We believe the organizers think that when experts or politicians think about possible solutions, they assume the concerns of one side. Today, in several presentations, the problems that we are faced, the challenges that we are witnessing in the region have been called North Korea problem, nuclear North Korea problem, which I completely disagree with. I think this is a dead-end approach if we call it this way, North Korea nuclear problem. The development of missile and nuclear potential has roots in the field of security. The security situation in the region is not settled. So the experts that make it look too narrow are intentionally walking along the wrong path. Let me say it once again. That is why we divided the challenges and threats in the region, and we are having this session now. And there is another session that will address the question, what can be done, what mechanisms can be deployed to reduce tensions in Northeast Asia, and on Korean Peninsula. I would like to thank all the panelists for finding time to join us. As you all understand, this is a very sensitive theme. And it's very important that we are having this session in this format. I would ask representatives of the press to stay in specified locations so that you are not in the way of this session. We respect what you're doing. We appreciate your cooperation. But this is a conference for experts and for the officials. We have invited the mass media just to give coverage to the event. Therefore, I would very much appreciate it if photographers stop making their noises in a second, or they should stand where they have been asked to be. It's difficult to work when everybody's looking at the reporters. If we cannot hear well, then we will ask all representatives of the press to leave the room. I hope that is clear enough. Thank you. First, I would like to give the floor to Madam Chon Soo-hee, who is the president of Institute for American Studies. Madam Chon Soo-hee, thank you very much for finding time to come over and make a speech. We at CENESS very much appreciate our contacts with the Institute for American Studies. I very much appreciate your willingness to participate in this dialogue on a very sensitive issue of security in Northeast Asia. I suggest that all presenters speak from where they are. We give all of you 7 minutes, and then we will have time for Q&A. We have to finish this session exactly on time at 3:30. Madam Chon Soo-hee, over to you.
As you wish. Okay? Please.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to express my thanks to Mr. Anton Klukov, Director of CENESS, Center for Energy and Security Studies, for the excellent arrangement of the current Moscow Nonproliferation Conference and inviting me to this conference. Today, nearly 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, the regional security of Northeast Asia is still facing the critical challenges involving the pursuance of hostile policies and strategic interests among the regional powers. The Korean Peninsula is the place where all such interests are intertwined, and today the Korean Peninsula is in the state of touch-and-go situation due to the U.S. hostile policy on DPRK. Whereas the Bush administration pursued the hostile policy toward DPRK by labeling it as the axis of evil and enlisting my country as the target of nuclear preemptive strike, the Obama administration had maintained so-called strategic patience and embarked on an all-out campaign to stifle DPRK by putting in place literally every single sanctions available. And today, the Trump administration is engaged in a reckless anti-DPRK campaign by not hesitating to make hysterical statements such as fire and fury and total destruction of my country. All we hear from the officials of the Trump administration is the U.S. dedication to the campaign of pressure and the military preemptive strike being put on the table, and these are the very reasons for and the answers to our efforts to pursue nuclear weapons. As for the DPRK, this is the matter of life and death, and the present situation further strengthens our belief that we should strongly hold to the nuclear weapons to deter the possible U.S. attacks. Every nuclear state, including India and Pakistan, as well as the permanent member states of the United Nations Security Council, made very clear when they were trying to possess nuclear weapons that the missions of the nuclear weapons are to deter possible nuclear attacks on their nations. And I want to make very clear that the DPRK's nuclear weapons carry the same mission. Looking back, it is worthy to note that each nuclear state had experienced tremendous ordeals in order to acquire nuclear weapons. France, as one of the old allies of the United States, has chosen to become a nuclear state rather than to be under the nuclear umbrella of the United States, and conducted more than 200 nuclear tests by asserting as to whether the United States was prepared to sacrifice New York to save Paris. The former Soviet Union, after its first hydrogen bomb test in 1953, made a statement that its country had gone ahead with the hydrogen bomb test to put an end to the monopoly of the hydrogen bomb of the United States and to secure the safety of the people of the former Soviet Union by balancing the power with the United States. The Chinese government, after its first nuclear test in 1964, made a similar statement that it is in the inalienable right of any sovereign state to defend itself, and China had to develop nuclear weapons to deter increasing U.S. nuclear threats on China. As every nuclear state has its own reason to develop nuclear weapons, DPRK also has its reason to develop nuclear weapons. DPRK is under the constant nuclear threat by the United States, and as early as last week, there was unprecedented military exercises involving aircraft carriers in addition to the flying exercises by the nuclear strategic bombers into the Korean Peninsula. Action invites reaction. The respected Supreme Leader, Comrade Kim Jong-un, in his statement made last September 21st, clarified the DPRK's position that he will surely and definitely tame the mentally deranged U.S. dotard with fire and make him pay dearly for his speech calling for totally destroying the DPRK. We would neither put our nuclear weapons and ballistic rockets on the table of negotiation in any case, unless the United States puts an end to its hostile policy and nuclear threat on the DPRK. The DPRK's nuclear arsenal is the noble result of the bloody struggle of our people to protect the destiny and sovereignty of their motherland from the prolonged nuclear threat by the United States. Today, we have almost reached final stage of balance of power with the United States, and our ultimate goal is to achieve a power balance with the United States so that the United States will not dare to talk about any military actions against the DPRK. At the same time, I have to recall that the government of the DPRK made it very clear on several occasions that the DPRK will regard all attempts to stifle DPRK in the excuse of the implementation of so-called UN sanctions resolutions as an act of aggression and war against the DPRK. The United States should take our position seriously and should make a decision to abandon hostile policy on DPRK. As the DPRK government made its position very clear on several occasions, I once again would like to take this opportunity to make sure that DPRK's nuclear weapons are non-negotiable unless the U.S. is prepared to coexist with the nuclear DPRK, because this is the only way to ensure lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula and the stability and security in the Northeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
From the chair, yeah, Ruby. Yeah. It is advisable to speak from the chair. Yeah. Наш следующий докладчик.
Our next presenter deals with Korean issue for many decades. He has been working for the State Department and for other government organizations. Today, Robert Carlin is a visiting scholar with the Center for International Security and Cooperation, the very well-known acronym CI-SAC at Stanford University.
Nonproliferation conference. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Anton, thank you for inviting me again, and especially thank you for organizing this panel. I've known Madam Che for 21 years, and all the time we've been sitting across the table from each other. So it's a pleasure to be sitting next to you, finally. The title of this, as Anton said, is Threats, Vulnerabilities, and Risks in Northeast Asia. We are lucky to be able to just describe the malady and not the cure, which is going to be quite a feat. I'm looking forward to that. It's also a pleasure to look beyond the current disaster to the horizon on which several looming disasters exist. This is not a happy seminar as far as I'm concerned. People used to describe me as being an optimist. I used to hear that all the time. Why are you so optimistic on this issue of DPRK US? And I was never an optimist. I always thought of myself as a pragmatist. But I have to say, since 2001, and certainly since 2005, I have not seen much room for hope. Since that time, there has been a winding down of the post-World War II structure of stability in Northeast Asia. And it may have been a mythical structure. It may be that we were fooling ourselves. But there was a period in the 70s and the 80s and even the 90s where a lot of people said, despite what was going on in the rest of the world, Northeast Asia was sort of an island of calm and prosperity. Well, that's obviously not the case anymore. And partially, I think it's because of brings to mind something Anton said. Our focus was too narrow. We were always laboring under the weight of events of the first half of the 20th century, that is, the Japanese occupation of Korea. We never really fixed that. And it's suddenly come back, roaring back to haunt us in a big way. That was then. We have to worry about the now and the future. It is the case that usually that there's no one event, no one single instance which defines the future. But I think in this case, we may have to look to something very specific. And I'm not talking about events so much as dynamics. You know, when a plane crashes and they do the post-event inspection, they usually decide that it's not a single event that brought the plane down. It's what they call a cascade of decisions. One bad decision, then another bad decision, then another bad decision. In my mind, I can hear the recording in the cockpit screaming at us at this point, pull up, pull up. And I don't see signs that either side, any side, is appropriately acting to pull up. We've gone through a long period of negative reinforcement where negative actions on one side have reinforced negative reactions on the other side. It's extremely difficult to get to this virtuous circle that we want of positive actions and signals reinforcing positive actions and signals. And the reason is because those forces in each capital which are negative are the best allies of the forces in the other capital. They reinforce each other. Whereas the positive forces, what Dr. Hecker has called the control rods recently, are usually too little, too late, too few. We tend to misread the positive signals from each side. And we've reached the point where I think there's hardly an inclination even to try to read the positive signals from each side. They simply disappear in the wind. Madam Che raised three things actually in her own address, which strike me as very important. And I don't know if we're reading them correctly or not. The DPRK has in the air three balls that where and how they land, it seems to me, might have a big influence on what happens next. The first one is the formulation that there are circumstances under which the DPRK might put nuclear weapons on the table. The second one is that they are approaching, not yet have achieved, but are approaching the final goal of finishing the state nuclear force. The final goal. And finally, that the final goal, as she said, is an equilibrium of force with the United States. Is that the outlines of a pivot point? Is that the point at which the DPRK is prepared to move from the first part of its two-line policy, which is a concentration on building the nuclear force, to concentration on the economy? Is that the pivot point, or are we simply opening the way to further decline and more negative reinforcements? And are we so far into our dive going down that we're not going to be able to pull up even if the DPRK does shift to something more positive? On the horizon, it seems to me, we have in front of us potentially some very serious negative forces. more bombs to explode. And I'm not here talking about physical bombs. I'm talking about circumstances in two of the major countries in Northeast Asia, Japan and South Korea. Population bombs. Both of them are facing very soon a shrinking population and a fast aging population. These are going to be so incredibly disruptive, economically, socially, and politically. And we don't know the circumstances that those are going to create on top of the tensions that are going to continue to exist over this nuclear problem. We've got political calendars in front of us, and we have learned to our sorrow that the pace of the change in Washington and a little bit in China and in South Korea force, usually in a negative way, events and decisions on the nuclear issue. We've got an election coming up in 2020. Sounds like a long time away. It isn't. Lots and lots can go wrong between now and then even more can go wrong. So we sometimes look to the sources of what we think are stability that are helping to preserve, keep us out of harm's way. One of those is the Armistice Agreement of 1953. 1953, think about it. Is such an agreement that is so old really a source of stability, or is it a source of suffocating stasis? Do we have to begin to look at not just the nuclear issue, but the broader parts of the strategic situation in Northeast Asia? Do we have to finally get past what we did 60 plus years ago and begin anew of creating the new circumstances? We haven't even begun to do that. The six-party talks, the September 2005 agreement, seems to me, is not where we should be going. We don't have much time. That voice in the cockpit, pull up, should be loud. You should hear it every morning you wake up. We don't have much space. We don't have much time. And it seems to me that the horizon is shrinking constantly for us to begin to address this problem.
Bob, thank you very much for being an optimist, inborn optimist. But you are a realistic person in assessing our current position. Our next two panelists are invited exactly to cover the issue from the standpoint of a Chinese and a Russian expert, so that they could address the same challenges that are present in the region in Northeast Asia. The first to speak would be Dr. Teng, a military, a scientist. At the moment, he is director of the Center for Arms Control and International Security Studies of the China Institute of International Studies, which is a part of the Foreign Ministry of China. Dr. Teng, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and it's a really great pleasure to be here. And this is my second time to attend such important conference, and I highly appreciate the sponsors' effort to organize such a big conference at this crucial moment. And the assignment given to me, I think you mentioned just now, a little bit sensitive, and I try my best from a scholar's approach to understand the threats, vulnerabilities, and risks in Northeast Asia. I think the Northeast Asia has become, again, a hotspot in recent years. Some said this is a result by the missile and nuclear test by DPRK, and some other argued this is actually a manipulation by the United States to maintain the control of ROK and Japan, or to maintain the dominant position in Northeast Asia. This is a geopolitical competition. We also have heard a lot of complaint about China's role in maintaining the stable situation in Korean Peninsula. and especially the President of the United States, Donald Trump. Once upon a time, he highly appreciated Chinese effort in this regard, but at other time, he criticized that China has done nothing to the denuclearization in Korean Peninsula. So this is a very controversial signal given by the current U.S. president. And in Northeast Asia, actually, different countries actually share different interests. I'd like to give some specific studies on these interests. The United States actually, during Obama's administration, I think he had adopted so-called strategic patience. After at the very beginning, actually, of his term, he gave some active, response to the exchanges between the United States and the DPRK. But after several rounds of missile tests, President Obama suddenly, realized he should, have some policy, and finally he got named strategic patience, which means the United States would like to do nothing, related to the situation in the Korean Peninsula. And I'm not sure President Donald Trump gave or has any clear-cut policy toward DPRK. Some said this is a maximum pressure on DPRK. Some said, no, this is only a response from the U.S. government to the situation in Northeast Asia. So this is a very controversial policy by the U.S. government. And the DPRK, of course, as Madam Secretary just mentioned, security concerns should be the dominant element for the decision makers in that country. And I'm sure our DPRK friends can give a long list of reasons for its choice to go nuclear armed. However, I think Madam Secretary just mentioned the Chinese way to go nuclear armed. I think there should be one point I'd like to mention here, the treaty, NPT treaty, which came into force in 1970. I think this is a very important line for the countries committed to the treaty. So this is a very important part for my argument that we should, show our international treaties, and we also show our respect to the sovereignty and the security of an sovereign country. And China, I think China, of course, has its specific strategic interest in Korean Peninsula. To be frank, I think the peace and the stability are the condition for China's domestic development. This is very important, I think. Just imagine if there were war in Northeast Asia, China, of course, would shift its attention to that region. So I think the peace and the stability in Northeast Asia actually is a condition for China's domestic development. This is our specific strategic interest. And also, the 19th CPC National Congress has been on its way, and I'm sure the leaders of this generation have attached great importance to the peace and stability surrounding our country. And if you look at the evolution of China's security policy, I'd like to divide it into three stages. First, immediately after the founding of the PRC, actually the leaders of China adopted, to some extent, an ideology-oriented security policy toward its neighbors, towards other countries in the world. And then after the open up and the reform, China adopted trade-oriented. So we got a lot from the trade with all the countries in the world. And if you look at the years after 2012, you can find security has become a very important part for our decision makers when they decide anything to do and to have some policies toward other countries and even the domestic policies. We established the so-called National Security Commission, and we addressed the importance of the military reform, and which initiated from September 2015. So China today has attached great importance to the security, not only the domestic security, but also the international security, which means the fast development of China requires such a security environment. And Russia, of course, is another important player in this game. Japan, to some extent, I think the politicians have manipulated the tension in the Korean Peninsula. For example, Shinzo Abe just, in recent days, just said, just because of the missile test by DPRK, and he would like to have a new election in the Diet. So also ROK. I don't think the leaders from Park Geun-hye to Moon Jae-in have any room to put forward ROK's own Northeast Asia policy. After the inauguration, the President Moon Jae-in has proposed several ideas to promote the peace and stability, but denied by other countries. So this is actually a dilemma for ROK. How can that country play a more and more important role in maintaining the peace and ease the tension in Northeast Asia? So I'd like to say something about the implications of the situation in Korean Peninsula. First, the historic implication. If you look at recent 100 years history, there were 4 large-scale wars, and no country in this region avoided the involvement. And China, Korea, Japan, and even Russia suffered a lot from these 4 wars: Sino-Japanese War, Russian-Japanese War, and also the Korean War. So we suffered a lot from the war. So this is a very important, reason for China, for many years, tried its best to maintain the peace and stability. So this is an implication from our history. And the second is the international implication. At the UN Security Council, I don't think there can be any consensus on the using force against a sovereign country in Northeast Asia at this moment. So this is a very important part for the international community to protect or to give some opportunity of some sovereign countries in Northeast Asia. So this is very important. Another international implication is ROK. As President Moon Jae-in recently repeatedly mentioned that ROK would not like to have any war or clash, even a surgical strike against DPRK. So this is another factor for us to think about the use of force in Northeast Asia. Third, I think there is a military implication. I don't think the military implication should be the number one choice for any country in this region. We have 3 choices at this moment in dealing with the situation in Korean Peninsula: negotiation, sanction, and war. So I think negotiation should be the best one for all countries concerned. So I 100% in favor of what Chinese government recently proposed, that double suspension and double track approach to the issue, because we are facing very different world. 3 tendencies I'd like to mention here. First is the multipolarization of international politics. No individual country can play a key role in deciding the important issues in this region. Second is the globalization of world economy. Such a connection among powers, among countries, can afford the price? No, I don't think the countries can afford such a price. And also, the wide use of information technology completely change our social life. So I think this is actually a new era for us to think about the situation in the Northeast Asia, not use zero-sum game theory, not use Cold War thinking. We need peace and stability for our own country and for the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tan.
Thank you very much. The fourth panelist during the session will be Alexander Vorontsov, who is advisor at our center, CENESS. Many of you know him as the head of the Korean Studies and Mongolian Studies section at the Institute of Oriental Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences. On many occasions over recent years, we visited Pyongyang together with Dr. Vorontsov. And in fact, we wanted to visit DPRK in order to better understand the logics and the motivation which is behind the efforts taken by DPRK in order to develop its nuclear and missile capabilities. If we are serious about defusing this crisis, we've got to be clear as to the motivation that each of the parties has. Please. Thank you, Anton. Thank you for putting together this very interesting and rich conference. Thank you for the invitation to speak here. All the panelists seem to have agreed that the situation in the Korean Peninsula is explosive indeed, and the risks are very high as of now. Unfortunately, this is very true. And what we see now is a lack of a dialogue, absence of a dialogue, and this is a crucial component of this alarming state. There is no normal dialogue whatsoever. And there is unrestrained escalation of hostilities and actions that are fraught with military action. As we know from history, one of the core causes of the crisis is the fact that relations between Korea and the U.S. remain unresolved. As Dr. Carlin mentioned, still there is this outdated Treaty of 1953 is in force, and the U.S. Are reluctant to normalize relations with DPRK, and now they are even not willing to engage in a dialogue. At the same time, we hear claims that it is the DPRK who is not ready to engage in a dialogue, who never honored its commitments, and all the negotiations are used by DPRK to cover up its activities. But, well, this is far from being true. We remember some successes. We remember framework agreement successes, and Bob Carlin in fact, contributed to this success. We remember a decade when this framework agreement was enforced, and this was the most peaceful decade in the Korean Peninsula. And after the dismantling of this framework agreement, after the advent of the Bush administration, DPRK continued to seek ways to ensure its security using international guarantees. My colleagues, experts on Korea, would support me when I state that at that time, DPRK wanted to obtain additional guarantees. They realized that the proposals and guarantees provided by the U.S. President were not sufficient. The Bush administration decided to scrap this framework agreement, and now the Trump administration is trying to eliminate a similar agreement, a similar instrument, but with Iran. DPRK at that time said, look, if the U.S. Congress passes a resolution that would be binding not just for the current president, but for future presidents, might serve as a more solid foundation for securing our interests. Well, obviously it was very idealistic and unrealistic approach. Clearly, U.S. Congress would never have
past such a move. But anyway, some attempts to find solutions were very much present at the time. Unfortunately, disillusion followed, and now we have what we have. Nobody's happy about the current state of affairs. Nobody likes the fact that DPRK now believes that only its own nuclear capabilities, only its own nuclear deterrence may serve as a strong guarantee to ensure its independence. But unfortunately, this is how the situation looks like now. This is a very alarming situation. Besides, this year, we saw some additional factors coming into play, including factors that have to do with specific leaders. You know, this duel, this fencing between President Trump and Kim Jong-un is something that puzzles global community, and quite frankly, we sometimes are even shocked by the format. And another analogy comes to mind here. I recall the memories, memoirs produced by Mr. Vasyukov, who back in 2003 was special envoy of President Putin, and he went to Pyongyang. At that time, the framework agreement collapsed, and the DPRK at that time was already made part of the axis of evil, and Iran was the next one to follow. So the situation was very similar to the current one. So Vasyukov went to Pyongyang, and he recalled how negotiations started. Now, Vice Marshal Cho Min-ho was the person on the Korean side who participated in that negotiations, and he said that all of the military in DPRK, from Marshal down to every single rank-and-file soldier, would be ready to fight the enemy. We're ready to perish in battle, but we will defeat our enemy. But our diplomat said, well, look, wait a minute. Before you perish heroically in battle, let us diplomats to try to defuse the situation. There would be no need for you to die in battle. Indeed, the six-party negotiations started, and in fact, we remember that those had some success as well, and not just failure. I think it is not by chance that our president, Vladimir Putin, in September in Vladivostok during Eastern Economic Forum recalled those negotiations, and he said that back in 2005 we almost reached an agreement, but unfortunately some countries started to demand from DPRK more that DPRK had promised, and this actually resulted in a failure of the six-party talk. Now, I remembered the situation, I recall the situation, because now we see a reverse situation. Secretary of Defense, that is, demonstrates a more restrained approach compared to President Trump. Mr. Tillerson says, look, we're in a dialogue with the DPRK, we're engaged in negotiations. Immediately, the president cuts him short and says, look, don't waste your time, my dear. It's just empty talk. There's no point in having such talks with DPRK. We know what we are supposed to do, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of examples of this kind. So, look, the U.S. military appear to be playing a role which is more constrained compared to the White House. And this adds to uncertainty. One of the most alarming features we observe is the fact that we witness an uncontrolled escalation of military activities on both sides. So 2 successful launches in July of long-range missiles by DPRK, and many tend to believe that such missiles are indeed ICBMs, although Russian military are not as optimistic. Still, the progress is obvious, and nuclear tests done in September Well, obviously, these are provocative actions. This is a blow dealt to the international stability, no doubt about it. However, military exercises that go on incessantly, joint military exercises done at the borders of DPRK is also provocative action. This is a direct threat to DPRK security. Let's recall the scope of the military exercises. In March and April, over 300,000 troops were involved. West 2017, Russian military exercises, we had about 12.5 thousand troops. And I hope you do recall the concerns voiced by European capitals. And in Korean Peninsula, as I said, 0.3 million troops participated. Now, our foreign ministry called upon de-escalation, and our foreign ministry urged the parties to defuse the situation. Yet we see new exercises, we see naval exercises, very strong naval force is offshore the DPRK, and of course the U.S. claimed that these are routine exercises and are no threat to anyone, but what they exercise in the course of such action is landing operations and decapitating blow. And this is what land troops are exercising. Special forces are heavily engaged in such exercises. And in October, the naval exercises also hone the skills of landing certain special troops to decapitate the DPRK. Look, obviously this is taken as a direct threat to security. Now, the joint statement done by Russia and China is extremely relevant. We call upon both parties to defuse the situation, to de-escalate the situation, and start discussing the issue in a more calm environment. However, the U.S. regard the situation as an attempt to undermine the system of military alliances in this region. Well, in conclusion, I'm very much hopeful that this escalation, this militant stance on both sides, the demonstration of the readiness to go till the very end, indeed, in reality, is a preparation for negotiations. It seems like both parties are trying to dig in for upcoming negotiations and upcoming dialogue, which I hope will finally take place. Thank you very much. We've got exactly 30 minutes for Q&A session. Once again, I want to emphasize that in the course of this session, we'd like to address the risks and challenges present in the region. We'll have separate sessions dealing with sanctions. We have a separate session on possible risk reduction measures. I would definitely welcome comments and questions, but please be brief, 2 minutes max. I would encourage other countries of the region to contribute to the discussion. Once again, our task here, the task of our think tank, is to understand how different countries view the various challenges and threats, and based on this, how we could proceed. Dr. Rabin, then Ambassador Lee. Please, microphone. Thank you. I'm head of the Center for Korean Studies at the Oriental Studies Institute. I got a question to Madam Choi. Last year, the leader of the DPRK at the Party Congress mentioned that DPRK would behave as a responsible nuclear state, would not transfer nuclear weapons to other states, and so on. Does this mean that DPRK formally, not being part of NPT, de facto would be ready to comply with the provisions of the NPT, Nonproliferation Treaty?
Thank you, Anton, for giving me the floor. As you suggested, I'll limit myself to, the risks and vulnerabilities on the situation. I think no one would disagree. We are, racing, against time. And as my Chinese colleague suggested, that the number one preposition should be that there cannot be another war on the Korean Peninsula. And without peace on the peninsula, that there is no peace in the region. And Dr. Kalin indicated, that the region has served for many decades as an engine for peace and prosperity. So without peace in the region, that there cannot be peace and prosperity in the entire world. Having said that, I think we are. North Korea's nuclear program is standing at a tipping point, being in a final stage of weaponization. So, I think this can be our last chance, but let's look on the bright side. That this can also be a best chance. The risks and vulnerabilities, the two biggest ones, as I see, is first, it's kind of a catch-22 situation between, the U.S. and North Korea. No one wants to appear, weak. No one wants to be the one who, blinks first. Each side wants to be, standing on a position of, the strength. So, under the circumstances, small things can spiral out of control easily and quickly. And second thing is, as my Russian colleague pointed out, there is no, reliable channel of communication. There seems to be, some, for instance, the New York channel, but it just seems a, the conduit, not a meaningful way of communication for dialogue. So under the circumstances, the most important thing is manage the situation in a stable manner. So, we have been witnessing, the longest spell of absence of North Korea's provocations since, September 15th. So I think we should do everything to encourage them to stay the course. Thank you.
Dr. Santaro next, and then we will give the floor to the panelists to answer.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you to all panelists. David Santoro from the Pacific Forum, CSIS. This is a question to Ms. Che. You mentioned, I'm here. You mentioned in your speech that the DPRK had or was developing nuclear weapons predominantly for deterrence purposes. And I was curious if you could elaborate a little bit more about how you perceive the roles of those weapons and particularly elaborate on what specific actions you're trying to deter. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for being brief. Для того, чтобы мадам Цой Сонхи ответил, микрофон нужен. Дайте, пожалуйста, микрофон перенос.
Could you give us a microphone, please?
Madam, since you don't have a mic.
It's on the table, so I will give you. Oh, you have it. Okay, yeah, then it works. Okay, please use this one. Пожалуйста. Okay. You should start, and then I will give the floor to other speakers. Please.
I think we were all off to a coffee break, so I'm sorry that I missed the first question by Mr. Jibi. So could you please kindly brief your question to me?
Yeah, I can repeat it. Last year, Marshal Kim Jong-un stated that North Korea will not proliferate nuclear weapon. So does understanding of Dr. Zhebin is correct that it means that North Korea is going to behave like NPT member state, but staying out of NPT, how it is considered in Pyongyang?
Yes. Of course, I think you know the history of our pulling out from the NPT, so I'm not going to narrate all these long history on why we pulled ourselves from the NPT. But as our General Kim Jong-un has mentioned very clearly last year, that DPRK is not going to proliferate or sell out our nuclear weapons to other countries, and will be committed to the non-proliferation spirit with regard to the nuclear weapons. So even though we are outside of the NPT, we, as our great general has mentioned, we will be committed to non-proliferation of our nuclear weapons. And I have to mention again that our mission, that the mission of our nuclear weapons is only for deterring the possible U.S. attack on DPRK. Thank you.
Madam, could you please respond to Dr. Santaro's question and react to Ambassador Lee comment if you wish? For the comment, but with regard to Dr. Santaro, as it was addressed to you to respond to that. David, can you very briefly to repeat it? 15 seconds.
Yeah, sure. I was curious as to whether you could elaborate on the specific actions that the DPRK is seeking to deter. Are you seeking to deter a specific attack, or can you be a little bit more?
I think you know what specific threats we are trying to deter, because I think you read newspapers every day that there are nuclear threats on DPRK. So do I have to read out all the newspaper lines, or? Okay.
Would you react to Ambassador Lee comment now or later?
I don't want to remember as a very dull-headed person, so I will skip that, okay?
Следующие эксперты. Доктор Евсеев, пожалуйста.
Next experts, Dr. Evseev, over to you. I have a question for our American expert. How adequately the United States take the DPRK's nuclear potential? Do you think they are exaggerating the range of their missiles? American experts have some idea. For example, they think that they have their idea of unpreparedness of the warheads. That brings about the question, if the missile defense is effective enough, do you think the United States could launch a preemptive strike against North Korea if the United States believe that North Korea can, in the future, create effective nuclear weapons? If the United States were to strike now, they could achieve a goal with using less force. Do you think it's preferable to some extent for the U.S. to use a preemptive strike now, maybe not even nuclear? Do you think the United States should? Before we take the next question, let me ask the technicians to fix the video broadcast. It has interrupted. It's not important for us in this room, but it does matter for the people in other rooms. We have many reporters who may rush into this room. If we don't give them some help, it will be much more difficult for us to work here. Please make sure that the online broadcast is fixed and is going. And make sure the tech is okay.
Victor Mizin from MGIMO MFA. Well, we understand that the situation like snowball is rolling toward, some kind of brink. And my question is to Professor Karlin and Professor Vorontsov. I mean, it's understandable that the People's Democratic Republic of Korea would never forgo its nuclear weapons in the situation when the United States is not changing its policy. And I don't see any signs. And we know what the risks are and what are the other crises in the region, which unfortunately is very close to Russian borders. And we know that many Russian and joint Chinese-Russian initiative, they go nowhere, as well as what Professor Vorontsov mentioned. There have been a whole set of previous Russian initiative on stabilization on Korean Peninsula. So my question to you both is, what you think could be a solution in the present situation? Should it be some independent actor who could be some kind of intermediate? Should it be Madam Mogherini and European Union suggesting something like a new conference as a substitute for six-party talks, which unfortunately are dead now? What kind of solution just to solve it and prevent it from, I think, a catastrophe? Thank you.
We will give the floor to one more participant, and then the speakers will have a chance to answer. Mr. Ilyichov.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I have worked for the UN as an expert in the past. Obviously, in the situation when international collective security system, as has been softly stated today, is witnessing a serious test. Could you speak up, please? In the situation, as it has been stated, when the international collective security system, based on the UN Charter, is being put to a serious test, although I could use stronger language. Northeast Asia gives us an example of a region where this system stopped working at all. The interests of all countries in this region and the United States are all different. For China, there is a threat of destabilization. There is a threat to economic and social development. For the United States, this is an increasingly serious security threat, although this is not an existential threat to the United States. For Russia, if things go from bad to worse, we may have an important part of our country impacted. For DPRK and for the Republic of Korea, these are completely different threats. That is the issue of survival of those nations and of the peoples of those countries. And that brings about a question to all the panelists. We understand the necessity and the importance of bilateral arrangements and negotiations, especially on the Korean subject. The only way out of this situation may be through negotiations. Do you think there are any prospects in doing something practically to create a collective regional security mechanism where six-party negotiation countries have agreed upon? Thank you. Thank you for your question. We're going to give it over to Paul Ingram, and then we will start taking answers.
From London, the British American Security Information Council. My question for Madam Chao. There was a statement, I believe, in the United Nations earlier this week that third parties would not suffer the threat of nuclear attack if they were not involved in a strategic attack on the DPRK. Is this the basis for a declaratory policy that could diffuse some of the tensions and fears and recruit the interests of states in the region to calm things down?
Спасибо, Пол. Для полной коллекции.
Thank you, Paul. Let me also make an input, a question for Dr. Tan. Our panelists from China, and then we will give on panelists 2 or 3 minutes to answer all the questions. Dr. Tan, what do you as a scholar think? What is a greater threat for security of People's Republic of China, development of nuclear and missile potential in DPRK, or the response from the United States, or use of the nuclear and missile technologies as an excuse to increase military presence in the region? I'm going to ask Dr. Vorontsov to start answering these questions. There were 2 questions for me in this lot. One is on use of European intermediaries, possible invitation of Madam Mogherini. I would like to hope that a joint statement by Russia and Chinese foreign ministries, although it has not been supported, but it still got some attention. We communicate in different formats, and we know that our partners are examining, are weighing up this proposal. So I would not really take it out of the equation yet. I do not believe that it has no future. That's one thing. We have never been against inviting third parties, fourth parties, other countries, organizations that could make a contribution to security. Russia, the way I understand our posture, always welcomes all kinds of negotiations with Russia at the table or without, although we would prefer to be at the table. Any negotiations, any efforts that would bring detention on Korean Peninsula would be a good thing. Whoever sits at the table. In the joint statement, we stressed the fact that we need to relaunch dialogue in different formats, bilateral between the 2 Korean states, United States and DPRK, trilateral, multilateral, all formats would be getting our support. All moderators, all intermediaries would be welcome if they can add to the security on Korean Peninsula. We are not against it at all. We remember that a short time ago, the European Union has been playing a positive role as a mediator in some programs. It has been a part of the energy project, Keto, and other things. Now, regarding the question that came from Mr. Ilvichov, whether I see any prospects of putting together any mechanism. It's hard to talk about prospects when we have no dialogue. Our calls for resuming dialogue are not getting any responses when a U.S. representative in the United Nations says that it's insulting to hear an invitation to resume talks, although this sounds really strange. The idea of 6-party talks or multilateral talks is not dead. And officially, for what I know, nobody has really made a decision to discontinue that. There is a working group or several working groups. One of those groups has been headed by Russian representatives, and it's been aiming to build an international mechanism. They have already done something in a situation when we are going to an uncontrolled escalation, when we switch from this escalation to dialogue, and I'm very hopeful that this would take place, then again, we are going to see prospects. There's hope. I'm sure that there is hope, but there is no confidence.
As I mentioned just now, I think the leaders of this generation of China have attached importance to the security of the country. For example, in April 2014, during the first National Security Commission meeting, President Xi defined 11 areas, including security in nuclear, and the political security, economic security, cultural security. There are at least 11 areas related to the security to China. So I think this time the leaders gave such a great attention to the security of the country. It's actually a very important part for China's future development. If you read the speech delivered by President Xi during the parade in commemorating the 90th anniversary of PRA on 30 July, he also addressed that the PRA's assignment is not only to safeguard the territory of the country, but also to safeguard the development process. That cannot be stopped. So the PRA actually enlarged its assignment. And in terms of the international threat, of course, China, I'm sure, has been prepared to deal with any challenges in traditional feature or in non-traditional feature. So, and also China would like to contribute greatly to the peace and stability in other areas. For example, the peacekeepers. Actually, China in recent year has contributed large number of peacekeepers according to the UN Security Council's assignment, and also the escort in Aden Bay to protect the commercial sea lane. So China actually not only addressed the domestic security, but also to address the international security and peace.
Bob Carlin.
A lot of the questions are really strategic in nature. And I'm not a strategist, I'm a tactician. So I'm going to dodge some of them, but there's one point I do want to make, and that is Madam Che has emphasized several times that the purpose of North Korean nuclear development is deterrence. And what puzzles me is that from what I can see, they have achieved that already. That their nuclear force as it currently exists is in fact already a deterrent. And so the question is, why is it necessary to take the next step or two steps, which in fact may be destabilizing, which may in fact tip the situation over into something less stable than it is right now, God forbid. I am reminded of what the DPRK did in July 1993 in our agreed framework talks, when they suddenly reversed course and said, oh, we recognize that graphite-moderated reactors are a threat, and therefore we're prepared to go to light water reactors. It seems to me that something like that would be very effective at this moment in breaking the tension and helping ease our path towards some sort of a dialogue. Not negotiating the end of this whole thing, but just getting us through the door so we can sit down and begin to talk again. Somebody has to take a step, and I think the DPRK is in a good position to do that.
Madam Chair, you have the final word.
I think there was a question addressed to me. I think he was. I think he quoted from the statement made by a speech made by my foreign minister during the General Assembly, UN General Assembly, and I think our foreign minister was referring to the possible nuclear reaction from the DPRK. Pointed at the United States' possible nuclear attack and not any other countries who are not related to such attacks by the United States. So our nuclear weapons are directed at the United States, and we view that the nuclear attack might come from the United States and not from other countries. So our nuclear response would be targeting at the United States and not the third country.
Thank you. I think it was a very useful session. Still, I'm sure that many of us still have questions. What are the risks? And of course, what should be done? And I think it was a very good point by Bob Carlin, who already started thinking what should be done to address those challenges and risks in the region we face. Коллеги, на этом наша...
This brings us to the end of this session.
Point for media. At that stage, Madam Choi Son-hee is not ready to give any comments to the media. As I mentioned at the beginning, we expect that if any participant has such a position, we please respect that. So I would expect that you respect the point that Madam Choi Son-hee at that stage is not ready to make any comments for media. Спасибо всем за участие в семинаре.
Thank you very much to all the panelists in this session. We're going to resume.